Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Michelle Gold, board chair at Holocaust Museum LA. Thank you all for joining us for today's program, Building Bridges. Building Bridges is a monthly discussion series that brings together leaders of community organizations for a conversation about working towards common social justice goals. You may have noticed that I just introduced myself as board chair at Holocaust Museum LA. Well, last Friday, we launched a brand new name, logo, and website. So as we say farewell to Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust, fondly known as Lamoth, we welcome a new era as Holocaust Museum LA. We believe our new logo amplifies our founder's vision, a world without genocide and a world without hate. Holocaust Museum LA is on a path to be a world leader in Holocaust education and relevant issues of inclusiveness and diversity. We invite you to visit our new website at holocaustmuseumla.org. For today's discussion, we are so pleased to welcome leaders from each of our 4 partner organizations. Rosie Arroyo, board chair of Hispanas Organized for Political Equality, Hope. Julie Bank, board chair of Jewish Center for Justice. Michael Lawson, president and CEO of Los Angeles Urban League. And Nancy Yap, executive director, Center for Asian Americans United for Self-Empowerment, CAUSE. The conversation will be moderated by Dan Schnur, professor at USC's Annenberg School of Communication and board member at Holocaust Museum LA. Holocaust Museum LA brings you programs like today's discussion at no charge. So if you are enjoying our programs, we ask that you consider supporting our work by making a donation to the museum at holocaustmuseumla.org. It is now my pleasure to formally introduce you to the moderator for today's program, Museum Board Member Dan Schnur. Dan is a professor at USC Annenberg School of Communications, UC Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies, and Pepperdine School of Public Policy. Dan currently presents a weekly webinar for the LA World Affairs Council Town Hall, which is called Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. As one of California's leading political strategists, Dan has worked on 4 presidential and 3 gubernatorial campaigns. Dan served as the National Director of Communications for the 2000 presidential campaign of US Senator John McCain and was the chief media spokesman for California Governor Pete Wilson. Dan, thank you so much for helping us create the Building Bridges program and for serving as our moderator today.
Michelle, thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. And as we do every month when we gather for the Building Bridges program, I'm going to start out by asking our panelists some questions, but then we're also eager to take questions from all of you. So please feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A function that Zoom provides us. We're very lucky today to have the able help of Saphina Goldstein. Saphina is with us every month behind the scenes, but today she's taking on a double role, and we're excited to have her, and we know she'll do great work. You know, Michelle, when we started these conversations some months ago, it was in the immediate aftermath of the very tragic death of George Floyd. And one of the things that the panelists and I have talked about over the last few days is the difficulty, even the cruel irony, that today's conversation takes place in the wake of yet another tragedy, this one in my home state of Wisconsin. And over the months, we've been talking about, as the title of our program, of our series implies, we've been talking about building bridges between each of our 4 communities in order to confront these challenges together even more effectively than we've been able to do in the past, knowing that in strength and unity, there's power. So today, because we've talked about these concepts in the past, we're going to try to take the conversation a step further. And what we'll try to do, at least in the first portion of the program, and then with your questions, we'll take this in whatever direction all of you think is most interesting and most beneficial, is what we're going to talk about today are some of the challenges that we face, both as individual communities and collectively, of coming together toward to form that more unified front that I've spoken about and that we've talked about over the last few months. So in talking about the challenges, what we hope is, even though that's a much more difficult conversation in some ways, we think it's a necessary conversation because we think it's incredibly important to acknowledge the obstacles that we're all going to have to overcome in order to work together in the way that we can and should be doing. And so what I'd like to do to start the conversation is I'm going to turn to Michael Lawson, who, as Michelle reminded you, as I think you all know, is the head of the LA Urban League. And Michael, I'm going to ask you to begin our conversation, and we're going to talk about some of these challenges. Given the events of the last several days, of the last several weeks, of the last several months, of the last several years, given the events that we gather to discuss, how can our communities work together more effectively than we have in the past? Oh, Michael, we have you on mute, so if we can flip your microphone on.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this important panel discussion. Yes, I think one of the things that I would point out is that what we witnessed after the George Floyd murder and what you are continuing to witness is something that is both remarkable and not necessarily something that happens often enough, which is kind of a rainbow coalition of people who understand that with respect to this particular issue, there is something that needs to be addressed, regardless of race, regardless of what tribe you're associated with, where you live. There is a recognition that there is an issue that we must take on as our own. And the fact that that has crossed cultural guidelines or cultural lines is not, it is remarkable, it is good, but it is not new. And I think one of the things we need to look at is why this hasn't happened more often. And I think a part of it is not just the balkanization of the various organizations, but the single issue focus that a number of organizations kind of take on as their banner. But what you saw here was something that everyone recognizes just wrong. And not only that, but they were given, more people felt like they had permission to speak out. On a number of occasions, I've likened what we're going through to what happened in the Me Too movement. There was no one who would publicly say that what was that the kind of activity that was going on in C-suites of entertainment industry and corporations was permissible, was something that was okay, but nobody spoke out about it for the longest time. The Me Too movement gave people, regardless of whether they were women, men, what have you, the license to speak out and say, no, this is wrong. To a certain extent, it's it's very, recently I thought about the children's book of The Emperor Has No Clothes. And it's until some child said, this is wrong, everyone else was bowing down to the king and saying what he was wearing was gorgeous when he had nothing on. There's kind of a herd mentality out there that is breaking down, but it's not as if, as I said, it's not as if this hasn't happened before, but what we're looking at and what I'm so pleased to see is a willingness to focus on an issue that is wrong in and of itself without having to internalize it and say, well, how does this affect me? And if it doesn't, then I don't need to speak out. That part is something that we need to universalize, if you will, I'm making up a word, so that when groups like this one come together, we're not kept apart because we don't agree on everything. There is always something that we can agree on, and there's always going to be something that we'll disagree on, but we have to have the conversation, we have to have the dialogue. And that, I think, had been missing with the social media focus on whatever you can put into a tweet as being the only conversation that you really want to have and what defines us. I think I've gone on too long, but I think it's important that we recognize that we're all in this together and we have to have this discussion.
Well, Michael, thank you. I think what you've done for us to kick off this conversation is given us a very, very helpful idea of the scope of the challenge. And one point I'm eager to come back to in just a little bit is the idea that coalitions have not just areas of common agreement, but differences as well that they need to overcome. And so be eager to probe deeper on that going forward. But first I want to come to Julie Bank from the Jewish Center for Justice and say, Julie, Michael has painted a fairly broad, fairly ambitious picture for us, and a fairly broad and ambitious challenge for us. Practically speaking, for those of us who are just looking to get involved, what are the first steps that need to be taken in order to forge the type of working coalition that Michael spoke of?
Thank you, Dan, and thank you for having me back on this panel to represent Jewish Center for Justice. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Michael, for perfectly setting up my thoughts. I want to take it, well, Michael talked it at a macro level in a certain sense. I want to take it down to a micro level, which is building the relationships. Really the first step that we need to take is we need to build a mutual friendship among each other. We need to get to know each other. We need to get to know each other in the context of our own communities and our own backgrounds. And we, really need to build a mutual respect and understanding of each other. We also need to acknowledge our differences, which we have. I mean, we all come from diverse experiences in life, and acknowledging those differences is important as well. Also, just being able to overcome the idea that there's only one answer or there's only one way to do things is very important in laying the foundation for any work that we can do, all the work that we're going to do together moving forward. The last thing that I think is really important is for all of us to let go of the notion that coalition work is pure. There's never going to be a group of people that get together inside our own communities or with other communities and agree on everything. It's just humanly, practically impossible. So letting go of the notion that we're all going to agree on everything is going to free us to really coalesce around the things that we can make change on and move forward on, and opens a door and a foundation for us to also figure out ways to come together on things that we might not agree on fully, but that we can find some common ground on. So I think those would be the first steps.
Okay. Well, Julie, thank you. Thank you so much. And I'll get you to come back to you also, because what we're already seeing in our questions is people asking, what can I do? And so what I hope all of you would be willing to do as we go through this discussion is think in those concrete terms that Julie just articulated when the opportunity presents itself. But I want to come to Nancy next. Nancy, for those of you who were with us last month, Nancy is the new executive director of CAUSE, Center for Asians United for Self-Empowerment. And I'm proud to be a board member of CAUSE, and we are beyond excited to have Nancy on board to lead our organization going forward. And we're very, very excited to have her with us again today. Nancy, Michael and Julie certainly didn't make it sound easy to take these steps to move forward. But I'm wondering if you can dig in even a little bit deeper than Julie just did and talk about some of the obstacles that we need to come from within our respective communities in order to move forward. What are those biggest obstacles?
I think for me, what I believe is that the fear that sometimes comes naturally sometimes with unknown or with change is something that could be an obstacle that also prevents us from truly partnering and collaborating. Fear of not being heard or fear of not being included. But also I think, especially in the Asian and Pacific Islander community, there can also be some language challenges in terms of the number of languages we speak and how we can engage in that conversation. I think there's also an understanding of our own culture and histories individually that can really inform how we relate to other people, and that we can be proud of our culture, be proud of where we come from, and also stand together in common values with other communities. And sometimes that means being vulnerable, and it also means being willing to have difficult conversations when we either don't understand or don't agree. And so I think for me that fear isn't just about the bigger picture of movement, it's also about those individual challenges we have with ourselves of putting ourselves out there and being willing to make those mistakes in order to build those relationships.
Well, Nancy, thank you so much. And those aren't easy obstacles to overcome, but I think all of you so far have given us some real encouragement that they can be overcome. So I'm gonna turn now to Rosie Arroyo, and unlike our other panelists, this is the first time that Rosie has joined us for one of these panels. And I must tell you, because I've known Rosie for some time, both through her work as the board chair of HOPE, Hispanas Organized for Political Equality, and on other projects as well. I'm just thrilled that you were able to join us today, Rosie, and I know that our audience is gonna benefit greatly from hearing your perspective. So I'd like you to do, if you're willing, is, Julie talked about the first steps, getting started. Nancy talked about some of the obstacles to overcome. I wonder if you'd be willing to take the longer term view. And once we found ways to work together in the aftermath of specific incidents, in the aftermath of specific tragedies, how do you form a coalition that sustains and strengthens over time?
Thank you, Dan, and just really pleased to be part of this important conversation. And, building on, what my colleagues have shared is, really the need, I think, that first step, right, that just also recognizing the magnitude that this historic moment in time, what it means. And in order, as we think of how do we sustain the change and the momentum to keep pushing and moving ahead, is going to require us to really also take a look and have develop a united vision and a united front, because as we're seeing with COVID, the well-being of one community is the well-being of everybody in society at large. And so there is a mutual benefit for all of us to ensure that we all succeed, that we all have equitable access to opportunity. And this time, I think, is really giving us this laser focus on the need for a much more multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition. And in order for us to really sustain these coalitions, we need to continue to broaden the movement. We should never think that we've reached that point, because as we've seen historically, and despite the progress that we have made in society, there is still a lot of work ahead that we need to do. And the challenges that we are facing are structural challenges, are systemic challenges that, have been institutionalized. And so as we think of how to really advance more power building narrative and change in the community, is going to be diversifying these coalitions and having a multiracial, multi-ethnic united front, where we can all see that we're working towards one vision, and putting our differences aside to really be able to work together. And that's when I feel we will be able to move beyond just transactional coalitions to really more transformational coalition building work that is really long lasting, and it's what I've heard before, the change that really sticks and lasts beyond this moment.
Rosie, I think it's exactly right, because it shouldn't take a particular horrific incident for us to come together. Because if that's the only time we do unify, we end up reinventing the wheel on a pretty regular basis. And so that more sustainable work, I think, is critically important. One point I'll make, because I've seen a few reference to this already in our Q&A box, is audience members looking for ways to get involved, for ways to make a practical difference. And Saphina, maybe what I can do, in addition to what we hear from our panelists going forward, maybe we can send out email addresses to the appropriate people in each of these 4 organizations, and encourage our audience members to reach out to any or all of them and find ways to get involved in the good work that each is already doing, and also contribute to the unification efforts that we've been talking about in today's discussion. So Michael, let me come back to you, because in a couple of people have already alluded to this briefly, is before we can start forming successful coalitions with other communities, our own communities must be prepared to effectively coordinate with others. And you made a great point at the very beginning of this conversation about how successful coalitions don't just have common ground of agreement, but they have to acknowledge and work together despite differences. So how can our own communities prepare to effectively coordinate with others to form that kind of unified front we've been discussing?
Thank you for that question. I mean, I believe it, quite frankly, starts with our various organizations looking within and recognizing that even within our organizations, we're not monolithic, number one. And number two, that some people in our organizations have it wrong, to be perfectly candid. There, a couple of the chats reference the anti-Semitic comments that are heard from people within the Black community, and I would submit to you that that again, this is in some part. I won't attribute all of it to this, but to kind of the soundbite mentality that we have since the internet came on board, and concepts spread that without much debate or discussion. And I've had these discussions with people, not just with the Jewish community, but with other communities. It was, why are we working with these folks when I heard this comment from them, or this is how they responded to this? And I sit down and have these conversations, and they're not as long as I would think that they need, that it would take. to explain that this doesn't define the relationship that we need to have with these other organizations. Yes, we have our differences on some issues, but for the most part, we agree on more than we disagree, and we can never take a position based on the ethnicity of someone, but what they do and what they don't do. And we can agree and we can disagree, but we have to make sure that it's based on some that it is not that we're not painting an entire culture a certain way because of a disagreement that we might have with a policy of some sort. These are the conversations that I've been having internally with people in my own organization, and the conversations are enlightening. People are changing their minds in terms of, oh, I didn't think of it that way. What I think is missing in this soundbite environment that we have is the open and conversations that address these issues, as opposed to just the repetitive sound bites from the 140 characters that come through Twitter and other formats. And I also want to say that we have to, the leadership has to be more outspoken on this. And I for one, am pushing leaders of various organizations to be more outspoken directly on this point. The fact of the matter is that you hear, it's the soundbite mentality, and we have to have longer conversations, and we're having those conversations. And again, I go back to the Rainbow Coalition of people who responded to the police murders that have been caught on videotape. To me, that is a very clear indication of what we've been saying, that we're more alike than we are not. And we have to, but we also have to recognize and accept our differences and talk them through and discuss them. We don't always have to agree on every single thing, but it has to be based on facts, not on prejudices and lies.
Michael, thank you so much. And I will just, because we are seeing several questions on the same point about how to get most involved. Saphina has just sent to all of you email addresses for these four remarkable leaders, and for me as well. And while we'll talk in future programs about those organizational steps, for those of you who do want to get involved and make a practicable impact, contacting one or more of us is the best way to get started on that. Let us know that you heard this discussion and you are looking to find ways to get involved and support our organizations and our cross-community effort. And we'd be thrilled to find a way to help you make the kind of impact that you're looking to, and excited that so many of you are interested in doing so. Nancy, I'm going to come back to you with a very similar question to the one I asked Michael, because I know it's something that you've thought quite a bit about. Talk a little bit, if you can, about preparing our own communities to be ready to effectively coordinate with others, even given differences that may exist. And of course, those differences, as Michael correctly pointed, exist within our communities as well. So what do we need to be doing in order to get ready for cross-community work?
Sure. I think one thing I feel is important, and I'm really big on history. I'm a kind of a history buff of my own. But I think also for me to see where folks who look like me, folks who have similar immigration histories as me, or different identities that I have, and how they've been involved in cross-coalition work. I can say that in learning about the work that Asian and Pacific Islanders have done to build with other communities over the years, it's really inspired me to not just seek them out to ask how that looks, how that works, but also feel like I have a model to follow to begin. And sometimes it is just that beginning. I think there's also about, it's important to feel like you're part of something bigger, right? Like, and I think collective impact is really important as well. And just realizing that we all have different skill sets, different things we want to do, and finding where in a movement your skills are the best fit for can also help that feel much more motivating and help to feel like there's more cohesion even when you're having those difficult conversations. So do you want to be out there demonstrating? Do you want to be in a position running an organization? Or do you want to have those difficult conversations with family members who maybe aren't on the same page, right? All of them are really valuable to a larger movement, and yet they look really different depending on the kinds of actions that you want to take. But together is how all of those little acts together is how I think change will really come, and change that we're all welcoming, right? And that will help us grow.
Nancy, I think that makes a lot of sense, and it didn't sound easy when you said it, but it is easier said than done. Once again, I'd encourage everyone to follow at least all of the points, but one of the points in particular that Nancy just made in response to the questions about getting involved in making an impact. When you decide to reach out, let the organization know. And Rosie, Nancy, Michael, and Julie will either answer you or put you in touch with their colleague who's best equipped to work with you. Tell us about yourself. Tell us about what you do, what you've done, about how you believe you can make the greatest difference. And that's going to help each of the organizations decide how to put you in a position to make the kind of impact you're looking for. So Rosie, I'm gonna come to you now, and I'm gonna ask you, once we've opened up these lines of communications, once we've prepared ourselves to do so, as Michael and Nancy have done so, and then begun communicating with each other, what comes next? What do we do then? Now that we're talking.
Yeah, I think as I think about these conversations, I think the next step is really having that conversation of, just recognizing where we're at as a community, and, feeling that when I look at, the issues that impact Latinos, I feel that, in our community, many of us are still waking up within our movement. And we need to kind of take stock of where we're at, but also what we need to do to clean up, right? And really do better, and have those hard conversations. And as part of that is going through a process to really help us understand also, and that broader narrative of the values that we have in common, and why it's important, right? The intersection of these issues, and why it's important to work across communities, across sectors, and because it's when we win, we all win, right? And so it is about how do we continue to inculcate that narrative that we see ourselves as part of a bigger and broader movement, and really think about challenging our thinking, and reimagine collaboration, making sure that we can get out of our comfort zone and be in spaces to be more civically minded, and to know that being civically minded is part of our DNA, is part of our everyday. It impacts everything we do on a day-to-day basis. And so the next step really is just continuing to not stop with one conversation, but that we continue to build and expand and invite others to the table, and encourage others to bring more people to the table. Because I feel that when people take ownership and they really see themselves as part of that change, it's when you see power, you see that change happening, and it's people taking ownership of their individual lives, but also the larger and broader society.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Rosie. And I think that's exactly the kind of roadmap we need going forward. Just to address a couple of things that have come up in the Q&A, is one person mentions the importance of the census, and they're exactly right about that. And what I would tell you, just like we were talking about a moment ago, not only when you contact one or more of these organizations to tell them about your own skills and background and where you think you can make the most help, tell them about the issues that are most concerned to you. There's an organization that's not represented on this panel, an organization called NALEO, which is an acronym for the National Association of Latino Elected Officials, which has made the U.S. Census and making sure it's carried out in as complete and as appropriate a way as possible, their top priority for the year. But if you reach out to any one of the people on this panel, they'll tell you what their own organizations are doing on an issue like the census or another that might concern you more. And if it's not their organization, they'll put you in touch with somebody who's prioritized that concern to the same degree that you have. And also, just to clarify a point that I made earlier, is I think it should be up to each of you to decide if you want to contact one of these 4 organizations based on what you've heard today or based on what you may read on their websites after today's conversation. But you should also feel comfortable reaching out to 2, 3, or even all 4 of them. That's really up to you. Everyone makes the greatest difference when they chart their own path. So you decide which one or more of these organizations makes the most sense for you, and reach out, and we'll find a way to get you involved. Julie, the other panelists have talked about these internal organizational and sort of unification challenges. I have to admit, it doesn't sound easy. Based on your own experience, what are the greatest challenges to building these coalitions?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges, I talked a little bit about externally, coming together and getting to know each other and build relationships cross community. I think that if we look inward into our own community, and I'll speak for the Jewish community, there's a lot of educating that needs to happen, and a lot of I would say there's a very big diversity of opinions among the Jewish community, and there's a diversity of backgrounds, there's a diversity of ages, obviously, generational, demographic differences. And these create differences of opinion, which of course we want to welcome everybody's opinion, but we also have to educate our community. We have to really, we have to convince people that there cannot be a litmus test when you're forming coalitions. There has to be a recognition that we have to come together regardless of whether we agree on every single thing. One example of that is, we as a Jewish community, wholeheartedly joined the Christian right to fight genocide in Darfur. That was hugely important. The cause of racial justice is just as important, and we have to also come together with our partners despite differences on opinion, for example, on the state of Israel. It's important for us to still come together and look forward to what we can do together. And I think that we really, when we talk about educating or re-educating, it's listening to, it's educate. I mean, I'll use an example of my own children who are college age and younger, down to middle school. And I feel that I'm, a forward-thinking person, that I understand the complexity of many of these issues, and they are consistently challenging my own notions. And it really gives me a deeper understanding of what I don't know, and also kind of gives me that foundation to then go out and help other people gain a greater understanding of how we need to move forward and what we need to understand as a community.
Julie, I couldn't agree with you more. And it is a different type of challenge for each community. And when I come back to you in just a little bit, one of the things I hope you'll be willing to talk about is how prejudice, and in the Jewish community's case, anti-Semitism, how that challenge may manifest itself differently in the Jewish community as opposed to others. I've also gotten a very, very smart question from one of our attendees who wants to know if there's been outreach to the Muslim community to tie them into the conversation. And what I will tell you is I have the good fortune of working with a wonderful organization called New Ground, which represents a Jewish Muslim coalition here in Los Angeles. And Saphina, if you have the chance, if you're able to go online and post a web address for New Ground, then that would be very, very helpful. It's a terrific example of how our communities can work together. I have one more question for each of you. And because this has been such a deep and rich conversation up until now, I don't know that we have as much time to go into the details of this aspect of the discussion as we'd like. But in the interest of breaking down these barriers, of getting past these misunderstandings, of realizing that a successful coalition has both similarities and differences, the question I'm going to ask each of you to answer in turn to help us take a step in that direction is tell us, what would you like others to know about your community that they might not know? And Michael, I'm going to ask if you'd be willing to start on that. Oh, and Michael, you are unmuted.
Yeah,
here we go.
Thank you very much for that question. I think that one of the things that I've come to understanding in recent weeks and months is the fact that a lot of other communities don't truly understand the relationship between the Black community and police officers throughout the country. A lot of the information that you see on the news is focused on the most horrific aspects of that interaction. And usually it's in lower income neighborhoods. Usually it's in the worst parts of Chicago and so on and so forth. And in recent weeks and months, I've been having more conversations about the fact that every Black person in Los Angeles, especially Black males, have had this relationship with LAPD that is confrontational regardless of socioeconomic status. It's something that we call the talk that we give to our teenage sons before we hand them keys to a car, before we let them go out on their own. And it's instructions on how to respond to police when you are pulled over late at night on a weekend, because it's not if, it's when. And when you are pulled over, here's how you respond. You drive to, when the lights come on, and if you're in a dark area, you drive slowly to a place where it's lit. You put your hands on the steering wheel if you're the driver. If you're a passenger, you put your hands up on the dashboard. If you're in the back seat, you put your hands up on the back of the front seat. You don't reach for your wallet until you're asked for your driver's license. You first tell the officer where the driver's license is, and then you reach slowly for it. Registration, you tell them it's in the glove compartment. You reach slowly for it. Nobody makes any sudden moves. It is terrifying. This is what my parents, the same talk that my parents gave me when I was 14, 15, is the same talk that I have to give to my two sons. And you let them go and you pray that they come back. And this is kind of the background that we all have. So when we see these horrific murders on videotape, we know that that could have been our son. And that's part of the trauma that we go through whenever we see this. And it's one of the reasons why we are so thankful for the coalition that's come out in the aftermath of these horrific police encounters. because it is something that we deal with all the time. And I know that this is the kind of story that I think we need to share. I think every group has their own types of experiences that they don't share outside of their group. This is one that I've been talking more about because, quite frankly, it didn't occur to me that this is something that others needed to hear. And like I said, I don't think it's unique to us, but it informs our relationship with the police in Los Angeles and in the cities across the country.
Michael, thank you so much for sharing that. Can't be easy to go back through such difficult memories and such challenging terrain, and I think it's of immeasurable benefit to all of us to hear stories like this one for many reasons. But going back to a point that you made earlier, to understand that even if different members of a coalition don't necessarily agree on everything, there's nothing wrong with that, because different people come to this common effort with different sets of experiences and different perspectives. Thank you so much. Nancy, I'm gonna put the same question to you as I did to Michael. What would you like others to know about the Asian Pacific community that they might not know?
Sure. I think for me, what I've experienced, and I think part of it also comes from my personal experience growing up in Ohio, and for many being like one of the only Asians they've ever met. And I think it's that as someone who is Asian or Pacific Islander, we're just often seen as not belonging here or as being foreign, no matter how American we also are. And that we are sometimes forced to choose or assumed that we don't have a pride in being here as well. And I think the reason that's important is as we talk about how things can change, there are many of us who want to be part of that conversation, but also that we're not like being proud of who I am as someone who's Chinese Filipino doesn't mean that I agree with everything that happens in Asia. And I think for me that separation of who we are is really important. However, also in media, there aren't a lot of representations of a diversity of our community. And so we're oftentimes compared to just snippets of who our community is and asked to defend or support those misconceptions or perceptions, right? And so I think for me, it's really about, for our community, we're also a community of immigrants. We also often, just because of how we look, we talk about how we have to be able to prove that we belong here to avoid any type of detaining. But really just also, especially during this time of the coronavirus and how it's being positioned, there is an increase in anti-Asian incidents all across the nation. And so I know we're tracking that as well, just to be able to also tell that story and that all these things can happen at the same time. We're not saying that this is the only story, but it's definitely happening.
Well, Nancy, once again, thank you. It's a very stark reminder that we all do bring different experiences and different perspectives to this conversation. The idea of having to prove that you belong in this country instead of the default being that it is assumed is one that not every member of the coalition, that every community as part of this discussion shares. And so being reminded of what kind of a challenge and what kind of ordeal that can be is of extraordinary benefit to us. So thank you so much. Rosie, I'm going to bring you back into this conversation with the same question. For those who have not had as much involvement or engagement with the Hispanic American community, what should we know that we don't know?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. And so very similar to what Nancy and Michael shared, one in terms of, that the Latino community is a very diverse community representing multiple diasporas, intersectional identities, and, it's not a single issue community. Also an immigrant community. Here in the US, about 34% of Latinos are immigrant. And immigration has been, I would say, I think it's important for us to really demystify also, when many times Latinos it's assumed that because you're Latino, you are probably, don't have status and are, victim and in the criminal justice system. So the immigration detention centers are, criminalizing immigrants, and there has been this narrative, and a lot. I would say that it's important to know that Latinos, very diverse, and it's an untapped civic population. Just as an example, here in LA County, there's close to 800,000. Latino-owned small businesses that contribute also to the economy. There is close to 800,000 lawful permanent residents that have their status, but just, again, it need to have that next step to become naturalized. And data shows once they're naturalized, they vote at a 2-to-1 ratio and increasing their civic potential. And so it's I would say overall an untapped civic population, very diverse. And Latinos also contribute to the economy in the U.S. about 184. Their spending power reaches 184 billion, and they pay more than 51 billion in federal and state local taxes. And so I think it's important to recognize the contributions that our communities, our diverse communities, make, and the potential to really tap into the civic potential for these communities to continue to support and advance the change that we need to see for the greater society.
Rosie, I think the word demystify is such an important one, because by definition, when something needs to be demystified, that means, not to be obvious about it, that it's mysterious. And I think you've all talked about it using slightly different language, but eliminating that mystery and developing familiarity is the way to accomplish the goals that we've been talking about over the course of the program. So thank you so much. Julie, I'm going to come to you for the unenviable task of wrapping up this incredible discussion. But I'll ask you the same question as I've asked the others. For those watching and listening who have not had as much involvement or exposure to the Jewish community, what would you like those people who want to be part of a coalition with all 4 of these communities, what should they know about the Jewish community that they might not know?
Thanks, Dan. I think one common theme that I'm hearing is that all of our communities within our own communities are very diverse. And, the Jewish community, the North American Jewish community, appears and is made up largely of white Eastern and European Jews. And that isn't really who we are in reality. We are actually a very diverse group from all corners of the world. And the generalization or the way that we're portrayed doesn't really do justice to the diversity of our own community, of the Jewish community. And also that the one thing that is handed down from generation to generation in Judaism is the struggle, the fear, the idea of being othered. And it's something that people might not know, but I'll just draw a story from my own family's immigration story, which was, my grandmother's family leaving Russia, getting on the boat, sailing steerage, doing the best they could to get over here, getting to Ellis Island and then being turned away because there were too many Jews in New York. So that boat had to leave that port, sail all the way around Florida, and ended up in Galveston, Texas. So growing up in Texas, which is where I grew up in South Texas, and my mother grew up and my grandmother grew up, there were no Jews. And there was always this, you know, fascination of, oh, you're Jewish, you must be this or you must be that. And I want people to understand that we know the struggles, we have lived them as well. And I think that, you know, Jews still to this day fear being, you know, not only fear anti-Semitism, but physically fear being killed for the fact that they are Jews. And I think that all of our communities feel that fear. And it's a common ground that we can all come together on. And I think for me, and I'll wrap it up here, having the opportunity to sit on this panel and to share my story, not only with the other wonderful members of the panel, but also with the people who are willing to come in and listen without judgment and embrace all of our stories, is a hugely important step toward coming together and really moving forward together.
Julie, thank you so much. It might have been an enviable task, but I'd say you handled it admirably, if not extraordinarily. So thank you. Thank you very much. Before we wrap up, I've done my best to integrate as many of your questions as possible into the discussion. And so while we haven't addressed everything in 59 minutes, I hope you think of these Building Bridges programs as the beginning of a conversation rather than the conversation in its entirety. And if you do reach out to any of these 4 organizations, not only is it a great way to make the kind of impact that many of you are asking about, but it's a terrific way of continuing the conversation. One question that did come in, perhaps the only one that I feel qualified to answer, given the talented panelists we have, from my former life as a Politico, is one question. We have a question that's come: how do politics instigate animosity among races and communities, especially when we are closer to an election period? Well, that's a conversation we'll take on in great detail, if you don't mind the shameless plug, in next month's program. Because when we gather next month, and by the way, for October, November, and December, we'll be switching to the first Wednesday of every month rather than the first Tuesday. But we will talk about these issues in the context of the American political landscape. What I will say just for today is that some politicians run for office in order to bring us together. Others run for office in order to divide us and tear us apart. And simply the best way of maximizing that first group and minimizing the second one is to vote. So register, make sure, given all the challenges we may face with the Postal Service, that we may face with the counting of votes, given the tremendous increase in absentee voting this year. Don't just register, don't just fill out your absentee ballot, but if you're going to vote by mail, vote early. And once you've sent your ballot back in or gone to one of the voting centers, then remind your family members, remind your friends, remind your work colleagues and the other people in each of your own communities how important it is to cast a ballot for the type of political leaders who do want to help the organizations on the panel today accomplish their common goals. So let me thank Julie Bank from the Jewish Center for Justice. Let me thank Rosie Arroyo from Hispanas Organized for Political Equality. Let me thank Nancy Yap from the Center for Asians United for Self-Empowerment. And let me thank Michael Lawson from the Los Angeles Urban League for leading us through such a fascinating and important discussion today. Thanks again to Michelle Gold for her leadership with our museum and within our community. And thanks very much to Saphina for the terrific work she did in making sure today's program came off without a hitch. And finally, thanks so much to all of you for joining us for these conversations. We hope you gain something out of it. We hope you follow up with one or more of our panelists, and we'll hope to see you again next month when we do take this discussion into the political and electoral context. Thanks so much. Hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. We'll look forward to seeing you in a few weeks.